speaker. The last pink card I have is for Kenn Quinn. We've seen Ken before. Ken, some of us had a presentation from, so he has some background here. Ken, thank you for being the final speaker and hanging in there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, distinguished committee members. My name is Kenn Quinn. I am the Regional Director with U.S. Term Limits, and I'm testifying in support of HCR 1. Obviously, because within the scope of this application is term limits amendment for Congress, as well as I want to see the state legislatures utilize their authority under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution to propose needed amendments. I was so encouraged by the number of people that showed up today. That is phenomenal. I just love seeing so many folks who want to see the state legislatures use this authority. And it was great to see Michael Ferris here today as well. He has been a leader of the reawakening of the Article 5 process in our country, and he's been a mentor to me. A little bit of my background, I don't think if I shared it in a previous testimony, but I used to fight that gentleman when he first started this. I used to hand out this DVD produced by the John Birch Society that says, "Beware of Article 5. Ooh, they want you to be scared of the Constitution. Initially I was, until I did my own research. It didn't take me very long to realize, wow, the framers were geniuses. I never knew why they put the convention mode in Article 5 until I actually read why. Funny what happens when you start doing some reading on your own. I immediately realized, wow, this is the mechanism that we need to use. And I called up the Convention of States at that time, and I apologized for opposing them. In fact, I handed out that DVD to the legislators in my state, and I had to apologize for them because once I realized that the information contained in that DVD was nothing but lies, I felt ashamed of myself for spreading them. And I'd like to share something with you, and I want to bring back the spirit of George Washington, because this is nothing new. This is a quote from the father of our country during the ratification of our Constitution, referring to the tactics used by the anti-federalists who were opposing the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Listen to our father. "The opponents, I expected, would endeavor to give it an unfavorable complexion with a view to bias the public mind. This evidently is the case with the writers in opposition, for their objections are better calculated to alarm the fears than to convince the judgment of their readers. They build them upon principles which do not exist in the Constitution, which the known and literal sense of it does not support them in. And this too after being flatly told that they are treading on untenable ground, and after an appeal has been made to the letter and spirit thereof for reproof. And then, as if the doctrine was incontrovertible, draw such consequences as are necessary to rouse the apprehensions of the ignorant and unthinking. It is not in the interest of the major part of these characters to be convinced." I say to you today that this tactic is exactly what is being used against this process. They stand on no constitutional ground. This myth of a runaway convention is nothing but a fear tactic. You cannot read Article 5. You cannot look at our history and believe that stuff. I heard one of your previous testifiers say that James Madison trembled at the thought of this Article 5 convention. The very letter they get that quote from, he describes the two types of conventions. A constitutional convention, which we talked about earlier, which requires unanimous consent to call, and which is what the anti-federalists were seeking at that time. They wanted a redo. He was not referring, that's what he was referring to, that convention, not the 2/3 needed to propose an amendment convention. That he supported. All throughout his life, he was a strong advocate for an Article 5 convention. In fact, one of your own here, Hal Shurtleff, I noticed he left. He wrote this in an article on the Weir's Times, July 22nd, 2021. He says, James Madison, who strongly opposed an Article 5 convention. I can spend hours sharing with you quotes by Madison strongly advocating for an Article 5 convention. He believed in it. And this guy runs something called Camp Constitution. It's unbelievable how they just dishonor the framers. All we have to do is read the debates during the convention when they drafted Article 5. It's clear. It's a limited convention. It's limited to what 2/3 of the states apply for. They voted against giving Article 5 the powers of a constitutional convention. The very first Article 5 application submitted in 1789 by Virginia was for the Bill of Rights. In the debates in Congress, now, this is very powerful. Over 50 members of the first Congress were either framers of our Constitution or they were delegates to the state ratifying conventions that ratified the Constitution. They well understood Article 5. And when you read the debate in Congress, every single person that spoke on the Virginia application knew we can't do anything until 2/3 apply for the same subject. And then it's out of our hands. And it's out of their hands because they knew Congress has no authority in this matter. They don't choose the delegates. They don't make the rules. It all falls under the states. That is why they gave us the Article 5 convention. The very day on September 15th when they were voting on it, and that's where George Mason stood up, and I'm glad he did. The way it was drafted still allowed Congress to propose the amendments that was applied for by the states. And he said, no, we want them to have no authority whatsoever in this process. The convention is the institutional rival against Congress. Why in the world would the state legislatures want to give them any? It makes absolutely no sense. So this idea that we've heard, in fact, the previous testifier, back to Madison, I highly encourage you to read Federalist 38, because James Madison talks about that second convention that he trembled over, and it's clear he's talking about a constitutional convention that the anti-federalists wanted. It was a complete redo. That's what he's referring to. But a gentleman previously also mentioned a John Birch Society scholar, I laugh at that, by the name of Robert Brown. He goes, and I think you have his testimony. In fact, I think Mr. Matthew Rhodes handed in his testimony. It looked very familiar to me. In that testimony, and what Mr. Brown does is goes around the country. He's offered a $10,000 challenge, and this is his challenge. Find for me one delegate of the Federal Convention of 1787 that stood up and believed they had the authority to propose a new system of government. And he says it doesn't exist. It's on your sheet there. You'll see this. I've answered that challenge over 5 times. He owes me $10,000. I highly recommend, I've got a YouTube channel just for that $10,000. It's called All Things Article 5. I encourage you, please watch my 5 episodes so far requesting the $10,000 payment because I overwhelmingly destroy his lie. It's fear. I'm tired of the fear. This has been mentioned. Why hasn't this continued to get stopped here in this committee? I don't know. All I ask is we stop being fearful. I encourage this committee, in closing, that we stop being afraid of what cannot happen, and be excited about what can happen. Imagine being able to partake and participate in a historic event where you get to propose an amendment that has been the desire of the American people for decades, and an amendment that everybody wants except those in power. Term limits for Congress, simple. 82% of the American people want that. This is federalism. This is the authority the framers gave to you. Now, I just found this quote I'm going to close in this, because I was studying about this process back in the 90s. Term limits was all the rage. This is an article from 1994. If Congress is truly a representative body which is responsive to the people, then it should propose an amendment to the Constitution limiting congressional terms and present it to the people for ratification. Congress's refusal to do so is the best evidence that it is not the representative body that the framers of the Constitution envisioned, thus giving credence to the argument that the framers would support today's state-imposed congressional term limitation. It is a sad fact that if the states are not allowed to impose congressional term limits, Congress never will, in spite of the will of the people, the supposed ultimate source of power. Members of the committee, this process is because the reason we're here today is because Congress is unresponsive to the American people. These reforms are not going to come from Congress. We're up to, 17 amendments already in 3 weeks in this session in Congress. And some of these are really good amendments, but they're not going to see the light of day unless you step up and put pressure. And once you do, they will start getting in line because they don't want you to do this. They fear you. They fear your power. And that is why we are seeking your support, all of you. I would love to see unanimous consent here. Vote ought to pass on HCR 1. Please, the American people, the people of New Hampshire, and New Hampshire, in my previous testimony, should be leading the charge because you have the experience here in New Hampshire. You sent delegates in 2017 to draft the rules for an Article 5 convention. You have had the most conventions for proposing amendments to your state constitution, proposing over 200 amendments to your own constitution. And you participate annually in an official convention of states known as the Uniform Law Commission. You are doing it well. You are well versed in this process. Do not let the fear mongers influence your decision on this. I close by just want to thank you for allowing so much time today. And I want to thank everyone that showed up, and I want to thank you for seriously considering this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.